Once there was a college professor who had a large lecture hall, and he had 300 or 400 students in that hall lecturing. Whenever he would get a chance, he would berate God. He would challenge God to various things, always trying to prove to these young students, these young minds, that God did not exist. Always trying to cast a shadow of a doubt. One day, as he began his lecture, he said, if there is a God in heaven, I challenge him to, in the next 15 minutes while I'm lecturing, to knock me off this podium. And he began his lecture, and as he was lecturing, he would every once in a while call the students' attention to the fact that he was still standing on the stage and God had not knocked him down, therefore there must not be a God. And he continued on. It got about 14 minutes into his lecture, and the 15 minutes was just about up. And just about 14 and a half minutes into his lecture, the door opened and a big football player, weighed about 350 pounds, offensive tackle, come running in, ran up on the stage and hit that professor, and he hit him so hard that he went flying. He landed in the fourth row of the people right in their laps. Now they're sitting there with their laptops and their iPads, and that professor landed right there, and this football player right on top of him. And he got up and he said, "What in the world is wrong with you? What are you doing?" And the football player replied, "Well, God was busy, so he sent me." This morning, you got to realize the power of God. You know, it's in our little minds that we kind of box God in and things the way that he works. It's got to be a certain way, but God a lot of times can use a 350-pound football player, or he may use just the fleece off of a lamb, or he may use the sound of the whistling wind, or he may use a shepherd's staff. Now, God can get his point across. Over in John chapter 7, I want you to notice two verses, beginning in verse 37, "And now the last day, the great day of the feast." Now this great feast that Jesus is going to be speaking, and John is speaking of this great feast, was the Feast of the Tabernacles. We know as we look at the time in which Jesus is making this statement that he is going to make, that there were a number of feasts that took place annually. And the feast that is taking place at this point in the Jewish year, the Jewish holiday, is the Day of Tabernacle. And it was a period of time in which they would look back at the journey in which God had brought them out of Egyptian bondage into the Promised Land. And their feast and their customs were a little different from ours. Generally, we have one-day celebrations. They would have a week-long celebration. Even in their marriages, you know, today, if you're really efficient with it, you get it all said and done outdoor in 3 or 4 hours. But their feast and their marriage ceremony and all of the feast and the celebration that went on with it, a lot of times would take an entire week for this to occur. And the Feast of the Tabernacles was a week-long feast, and the climatic time of that feast was the day in which the priest would go to the pool of Siloam, and with a golden pitcher, they would dip into this pool, and then in a great procession, which was a lot like a parade. You know, we have parades which we celebrate things. And in this procession, they would go from the pool of Siloam down to the temple and pour the water that they had gathered in this golden pitcher. They would pour this water upon the altar. Now, while this is taking place, this is the priests have gone and have gotten the water, and as they're coming back through the streets, Jesus is going to make a statement. In verse 37, he says, as he stood and he cried out. In other words, he is going to shout. See, as they were going to the streets, there were a lot of singing, and there was a lot of celebration of them remembering the redemption. You remember that it was the water that came from the rock, and this water from this pool of Siloam is representing this redemptive water that Moses had received and the children of Israel had drank from. And so at the climax of this celebration, Jesus stands and he announces very loudly. He's crying out to them. He's shouting to them. And notice what he says in this setting. If anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink. He who believes in me, as the Scriptures said, from the innermost being will flow rivers of living water. Now notice that John says in verse 39, but this he spoke of the Spirit, whom those who believed in him were to receive, for the Spirit was not yet given, because Jesus had not yet been glorified. Of course, we understand that the Spirit is not going to be given until Christ has died and resurrected is ascended. But the point is, Jesus says that if you're thirsty, come, and I will give you water. The water that I'm going to give you is abundant water. It is abundant living. He says, I will give you water. And notice that he says, this is the innermost being of the flow rivers of living water. You know what living water is? Well, there's several kinds of water. You know, there's distilled water, there's spring water, there's all kinds. There's artesian water, there's salt water. You name it, there's all kinds of water. But Jesus speaks of living water. Living water is what we would call spring water, flowing water, as opposed to water that was collected and stored in cisterns. Now, I know over Johnny and his mother's house has a cistern back there. I know Charlie, he has to kind of watch that he doesn't fall in the cistern back there behind her house, because this was a dugout hole. And then it is lined with brick, and water, generally rainwater, would be gathered and stored in this cistern. Well, it's good water, but after a while, you've got to remember it's stored. And so it may get a little stale, but yet it's still good water. Now, this is not cistern water. A lot of the water that is spoken of in the Bible is water that actually was cistern water, water that had been stored over a period of time. And it might have a little funny taste to it. But living water is water that comes from a free-flowing stream of water. And it was considered the best of water. And Jesus says, now, the person who will come and drink of me is going to have abundant living, to the point that rivers of flowing water, living water, is going to not just flow in them, but is going to flow out of them. It is going to be such that they're not a sponge, but they are a spring. You know, ask yourself this morning, when it comes to the blessings of God, are you a sponge or are you a spring? A sponge absorbs. That's all it can do. It just keeps absorbing, isn't it? It absorbs. Do you just absorb the blessings of God? Is it that your being is such that you have to be ministered to all the time? Or are you a spring? A spring by nature is flowing outward. It does not flow inward, but it flows outward. Ask yourself, by the way you talk to people, by the attitudes you have toward others, by the way you treat people, by the encouraging words that you speak, is it one that is a sponge that's flowing toward you, or is it a spring that is flowing outward? You see, he says that when you get to this abundant living, and notice with me that John ties this together, because Jesus says, I'm speaking of the Spirit. Now the Spirit has not come. He hasn't even discussed the Spirit with the children yet, or with the disciples yet. Later on he will. He's going to tell them that I must leave, that the Spirit comes. But I want you to notice something about our salvation and about our Christian living. At Calvary, now notice there are two places of significance in the New Testament when it comes to Christian living. At Calvary, we receive pardon. We receive pardon. We receive life. But at Pentecost, we receive power. See, there's difference. There's power, but there's also our pardon, and there's also power. And that's what he is referring to here. Jesus is not just talking about salvation, but he's talking about living that Spirit-filled life. Jesus said later in John 10, we're in John 7, but if you go to John 10, verse 10, he says, the thief comes but to kill and to destroy, but I come that you might have life and have it more abundantly. Later on, the Apostle Paul in the book of Galatians is going to say that we walk in the Spirit. And we're to bear the fruits of the Spirit. The fruits of the Spirit are the byproducts of what a Spirit-filled life is going to look like. Now, would you like to have the fruits of the Spirit in your life? Well, you can have them. You can have them. And Jesus says that pardon comes at Calvary, but at Pentecost power comes. And he illustrates this by saying in John chapter 11, it's kind of interesting that this whole thing begins in John 7, goes to John 10, now to John 11. In John 11, Jesus is going to Bethany for the express purpose of seeing Lazarus, who is dead and is in the grave. You remember that Mary and Martha, both of his sisters, say to him, Lord, if you'd just been here, he wouldn't have died. They're both really distraught at the fact that Jesus, you missed a great opportunity to serve a friend. And Jesus now is going to go to the tomb. He declares in verse 25, I believe it is, that he is, John 11, verse 25, he says that I am the resurrection. And he tells both of them that, well, you're going to see him again in the resurrection. And they said, well, we understand he's going to be resurrected at that last day. They believed in a resurrection. Jesus says, no, you don't understand. There's going to be more to it than that. And he goes, he has the doorway, the tomb open, the stone that sealed the tomb is removed, and he cries for Lazarus to come forth. And Lazarus does come forth, and I want you to notice now with me, and sometimes, we miss the nuances of what's going on in the situation. So Jesus cries to bring him forth, and he comes forth. He has life. But I want you to notice with me in verses 43 and 44. And he said these things. He cried out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. And the man who had died came forth. Now he has life, but he's bound hand and foot. He has life, but he is bound with wrappings over his hands, his feet, his face are wrapped around him with cloth. And notice what Jesus says in verse 44, verse 44. Verse 43, he gave him life, but he said, loose him and let him go. In verse 44, not only did he have life, but he had liberty. See, he's bound. He gave him life, he gave him liberty. See, the abundant life means not only life, but liberty as well. The power not to do what you want to do. That's not what true freedom is all about. Freedom is not defined as, well, I'll just do anything that I want to do. You do that, you'll end up bound to your own and enslaved to your own passions. But true liberty is being free and free enough. Now here's the point. Free enough to do what I should do. Wouldn't you like to have that kind of freedom? To do what you ought to do? Not be bound by the spirit of fear. Not be bound by the spirit of self-centeredness. Not be bound by the spirit of pride. But to be loosed and freed from those that I will do what God wants me to do. See, now that's one of liberty. Now that's kind of the background of where we are. Now, if you want that kind of life, if you want life and liberty, God can give you life and liberty. Because you see, a lot of people think that life and liberty come in a number of ways. That number one, it can come from intellectualism. It comes from intellectualism. And when I speak of intellectualism, they think they can just learn and they're going to be liberated. But that's not necessarily true. As a matter of fact, just knowing the facts about somebody does not mean you know them, does it? It doesn't mean that you know them. When I was growing up, there were a couple of bubblegum companies that had, remember those baseball cards? You remember those that go to the store and you can buy a pack of cards for a nickel? You remember that, Steve? And you open up that pack and there were 5 cards and a stick of some of the hardest bubblegum you ever tried to chew in your life. And I mean, you better have good teeth and you better be young because it's going to be tough. But you look at that card and have a picture of the baseball player, and then on the back you have all of what we call his vital stats. How many home runs he's hit, if he was a pitcher, how many no-hitters, that kind of information about him. And it would be filled with all kinds of pertinent information about him. And I used to remember laying in bed, looking at those cards at night, and Didn't have a TV in my room, boys and girls, at this time. We had a black and white one, believe it or not. We had one TV in the house. I remember that movie Back to the Future. You know, they asked the main character played by Michael J. Fox, says, "Do y'all have a TV?" And he says, "Yeah, you know we do. We got 3 of them." And the guy looked at him and says, "Why would you want 3 TVs in your house?" Well, today, just about every room's got a TV in it, doesn't it? How many TVs do you have in your house? You'd be surprised. Yeah. But anyway, we'd have that one TV. You remember that? That one TV, and you went to your room, you had to entertain yourself either by reading or looking at baseball cards or whatever you like to do with some type of a hobby. And I'd read that stuff, and I'd memorize it. And I could tell you about old Mickey Mantle, I could tell you about Whitey Ford, you can tell I like the Yankees. I could read about Roger Maris with it, you know, all these guys, you know, I could read it, I'd tell you all about those. But you know, I never heard of them. I didn't know them. You see, knowing statistics and information is not knowing that person. Abundant living comes whenever I have true, intimate knowledge of that person, not just statistics. Not just statistics. And so it's not intellectualism. Another thing, some people think that abundant life and they think that liberty comes in emotionalism. Emotionalism is important. Jesus said, "Love the Lord thy God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind." It includes the emotional part of it. But spiritual living in life and liberty doesn't come with just getting worked up emotionally. Having this kind of success that Jesus is talking about, this abundant life, doesn't come with self-righteousness. Over in Luke 18, Jesus speaks of a Pharisee who was able to pray in the temple. You know, I thank God that I'm not like all these other folks, but I do all of these things, and I'm glad I'm not like this old sinner. And Jesus said to sinner, you know, he wouldn't even look up, but smote his chest and said, "Have mercy on me, God, for I'm a sinner." And he asked the question, now which one of them went from there justified? You see, it doesn't come in self-righteousness. And not only that, it doesn't come in the idea of activity. Now, activity is important, but it's not just activity. It's not just righteousness. It's not just emotionalism. It's not just intellectualism. We've got to develop a strong, deep relationship with God. That's spiritual walking with the Lord. And how do I do that? Through the Word of God. Getting into the Word. If you want to get into Jesus, you get into the Word, because what is the Word? John 1 says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. And the Word became flesh." Well, verse 14. Who was that became flesh? The Word. What's His name? Jesus. That's Jesus. You get into the Word, you get into Jesus. You want intimate knowledge of Jesus, you've got to get into the intimate knowledge of God's Word. Now, you've got to look at the subject. Who is He talking to? Well, He said, those who are thirsty. He didn't say it's for everybody. He says it's for those who are thirsty. There's the subject. Those who are thirsty. Notice what He says in John chapter 7 in verse 37. "If anyone is thirsty, let him come unto me." We underestimate the power and the force of thirst so many times. You remember a song, "Can't Get No Satisfaction"? I think that was back in the 60s, old song. Some of you may remember that song. Well, the reason that many people cannot get satisfaction spiritually today is because they're not willing to answer yes to this question. How many of us really want spiritual victory at any cost? We want the victory, but not at certain cost. Or it may be, how many of us want to be used mightily for God? That God, I want you to use me at whatever the cost it is to me. Some of us say, well, you know, I'm willing to be used by the Lord, but there's going to be a cost. No, can't do that. You have to really want it. You have to be thirsty. How much would you pay for a glass of water? I usually keep water up here because sometimes I have to have a drink of water. But for most of us in here, you probably wouldn't give me anything for it right now. Depends on where you are, doesn't it? It depends on where you are. If you're over in the desert somewhere and you haven't had water in a few days, you're probably getting watered out saying, well, just, whatever I got, I'm going to get for water. But while it may not be that valuable to you at this point in time, did you know one time I gave $6 for a bottle of water like this? And was glad to do it. It was back whenever the Olympics was going on in Atlanta. I had taken Adam to a baseball game. The U.S. was playing North Korea or South Korea, and I think there were some SEC boys that were pitching, and we wanted to see that game, and so we spent an afternoon there at Atlanta in that Olympic stadium, and it was hot. It was in the summertime, and when we were getting ready to go, we had to have water, and I gladly gave them $12 for 2 bottles of water. You see, it just depends on where you are, doesn't it? Thirst, like I say, thirst can be a very powerful force. And the reason many of us don't want any more of God is because, and the reason we don't have any more of God is because we don't want any more of God. But Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew chapter 5, He said, blessed are they who hunger and thirst after righteousness. The word hunger and thirst, these words literally mean to be starving, to be dying of thirst. And until we get to that point that, God, I really want you at any cost, we're not going to have it. We're not as thirsty as we think we should be. But thirst can be a very powerful force. One time there was this little girl that had put her to bed, and things had quietened down, and everybody was about to sleep, and she hears that little girl go, Mama, Mama, would you bring me a glass of water? So the mother gets up and goes and gets the little girl a drink of water, or a glass of water. She drinks it and goes back to bed. 30 minutes later, Mama, could you bring me another drink of water? So she gets up again, gets her another drink of water. Then her mother, just about to say, Mama, can you bring me another drink of water? And she says, if I have to come in there again, I'm going to spank you. Well, everything was quiet for about 15, 20 minutes. Mama, when you come in here to spank me, would you bring me a glass of water? Thirst can be very powerful. And you see, we've got to allow thirst, hunger and thirst for God's Word. We've got to have that kind of thirst. And let me tell you, you got to understand the source of it too. He says, he that is thirsty, come unto me. We've got to come to Jesus. But the problem with coming to Jesus many times is, to come to Jesus, I've got to leave self. It's 2 parts. I got to leave self. Leaving self can be a very difficult thing. That's why Jesus said that if you're going to follow me, you're going to have to deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow after me. And only those who are thirsty for righteousness, are going to be willing to do that, according to John 8:34. And so we've got to understand the source is Jesus. But then, let me tell you finally, we've got to understand the secret. He says, if anyone is thirsty, let's look at John 7, verse 37 again. If anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink. You see, it's not enough to preach about it. It's not enough to sing about it. It's not enough to pray about it. You got to really want it. And you got to appropriate that blessing. Jesus says, I'll provide all the water. Did you know the last beautiful commandment that is given to us, and really just a wonderful setting is found over in Revelation, the very last chapter, for the Spirit and the bride say, come, and he that heareth say, come, and let him come and drink of the water of life freely. The word freely there doesn't mean just free of charge. Now, God is going to give you salvation free, but it means to drink as deeply as you need to drink because the source is there. But the secret, you see, Jesus is the source, but the secret is I've got to appropriate this water to myself. That's something I have to do. For instance, you've got money in the bank. You go down to the bank and you walk up to the teller and you go, I believe I want to withdraw $100 out of my account. Okay, that's fine. You got a withdrawal slip? No, I don't have a withdrawal slip. Okay, well that's all right. Just give me your account number and we can get it. Well, I don't have my account number with me. Well, what's your social security number? Well, I don't know my social security number and I left my social security card at home. Guess what? You're not going to get money out of that bank. I don't care if you got $1 million in there, unless you follow the proper protocol and the proper procedures to get that money, you're not going to get it out. Now, the secret to this is you follow the proper protocol. What is that? Renewing your mind, walking in the Spirit, and then you get it. You say, then you get it. We sometimes are so big on teaching and preaching, but you got to remember, you got to apply this to your life. You got to live it out. You got to put it in there, and you got to assimilate it. It's like a workshop. And when he got to the workshop, just before he got there, his car broke down, so he had to get out and walk for several miles. He finally got there, and he was dehydrated. And so somebody said, well, you need a glass of water. And so they go and get him a glass of water. Now, if he doesn't drink that water, it's not going to do him any good. And the same thing is true when it comes. We can have Jesus, we can sing about Jesus, we can pray about Jesus, we can talk about Jesus, but if we don't consume Jesus into our bodies, into our minds, into our spirits, it's not going to do us any good. See, that's the secret right there. Is I've got to appropriate it. Just like a man dying of thirst. He can have all the water in the world sitting beside him, but if he doesn't drink the water, it's not going to help him, is it? You're a nurse. Believe you, because you're a nurse. But you got to have that water, but you got to drink the water, right? The same thing is true. You've got to drink of the water of life, which is Jesus. Tonight, or this morning, have you drank of the water of life? Are you drinking of the water of life? You need to put your oil over the baptism this morning and take some time to do that. It's a time for you to begin to live for the Lord, to study His Word, and to make application to your life. Today Jesus says, if you're thirsty, let Him come and drink freely of the water of life. Abundant living can be yours. Why don't you come as we stand and sing?